Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar today put on by the Addiction Prevention Coalition headquartered here in Birmingham. My name is Art Wimberly. I'm a volunteer for Addiction Prevention Coalition, APC, also a person in long-term recovery. I'm also a certified recovery coach doing work with Enneagram and 12-step groups and individuals. And I also volunteer for Freedom Counseling Ministry in Central Alabama, and am glad to be with you today. I have with me my great friend, Tim Clay. I'll introduce Tim, or he'll introduce himself to you in just a few minutes. But we are here today to talk together as men in long-term recovery about this issue and dynamic of sponsorship, what it means to be a sponsor in recovery, whether that's 12-step recovery or any type of recovery, how to look for a sponsor, what's a healthy sponsor and an effective sponsor. And we'll just have a dialogue about our own experience with sponsoring and sponsorship throughout the last couple of decades. And then we also invite you guys, as you're watching, to get on the Q&A button. If you have a button during a question during our discussion, you can send it in that way. And we will do our best, I promise, to get to as many questions as possible during this hour or so that we have together. Again, thank you. We'll wait just a moment, pause, as people are beginning to log on here. We'll give a minute or two more for everybody to catch up to us. And then Tim and I will tell you a little bit more about ourselves and our relationship, and then we'll begin to talk in depth about the sponsor experience. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know people will be joining us as we go. Again, my name is Art Wimberly, and this is brought to you by Addiction Prevention Coalition, headquartered in Birmingham. And joining me today is Tim Clay. Tim's going to tell you about himself in just a minute. I'm from Birmingham, actually was born here and grew up here, never really left. So I'm a son of the South and been in Birmingham all my life. Entered into recovery about 20 years ago. Didn't go into it thinking I needed it. Initially went into 12-step work because of the addictions of 2 of my 5 children. And that was sending our life into chaos. And my wife, Carrie, and I, who's also with APC, began to look for support. And we went to 12-step groups, as I said, about 20 years ago. Eventually, about 3 years in, all the work I was doing in 12-step began to convict me, and I began to have to confront my own hidden addictions. In my 20s and 30s, I struggled some with substance abuse, but was able to get away from that. But what was hidden for a long time for me was what the DSM would call a process or behavioral addiction. And for me, that was sexual addiction. And so I began to confront that in 12-step work about 17 years ago and began to get freedom from that, and have found it healthy to be a person in lifelong recovery. Along the way, I met Tim, who's become my best friend. And but we've also had a unique relationship with both sponsor and sponsoring each other. And Tim will claim he's from the South, but he's really, I think, right on the border of being a Yankee. But Tim, you go ahead and tell them about yourself and where you're from. You got to unmute. I think you're muted.
Sorry.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, yeah, my name's Tim Clay, and I'm going to steal a phrase from Art. I am a son of the South. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, which is right below the Mason-Dixon line. Came to Alabama because I went to college up in Huntsville, and left college, got married, started working with a corporation all in the same year. And I came into recovery at the age of 52. I had struggled with drugs for a lot of my life. I was pretty much a functioning pothead. when I came to recovery, one of the first things that I was told was that I had to get a sponsor. And so I think that's having a sponsor has always been, or being a sponsor has been, a very important part of my recovery.
Yeah. And just a little bit more of our background. So Tim and I are roughly the same age. We met in recovery together, and we quickly found out we had one other thing in common, and that was that we were lifelong basketball freaks. And so one of the things we did to connect in recovery was to talk about anything about basketball. We knew the same players, we watched the same teams, we played a lot together. But I think, Tim, since we all know that confession is good for your recovery, perhaps you'll tell the folks out there about the first time that you and I played one-on-one, a little bit about the results of that, maybe.
So he's still bragging about the time he skunked me because I'm gonna really be honest. Art was my sponsor.
Oh.
He had helped me a lot. And I didn't want to mess up that relationship.
Oh, so now you're changing history, right?
Well,
and saying that you let me win. Is that what?
I didn't realize you were going to be that serious about it.
Oh, okay. I got it.
Okay. A slightly different spin.
Yeah. So all kidding aside, our connection was first with recovery. Then it was with basketball. But then over the years, we've grown to really love each other, support each other, and become the best of friends. And both of us have seen over the years that even though there are many things in which we're different, the longer we are friends and co-sponsoring each other, the more we see we're way more alike than we're different. Does that make sense, Tim?
Well, I mean, the one thing, and this might be a little off, but I mean, like, I think that in recovery, hopefully I see just people as human beings. It doesn't matter age, race, color, religion, area they're from. It's like they're just another human being, and we all struggle with something.
Yeah. So it's kind of like being in recovery equalizes things in reality. Yeah.
Well, and I think that, like, for me, when I was younger, when I would hear about 12-step meetings or, recovery, it seemed like something you had to go through, or it was like something that had an end.
Yeah.
And now it's just a part of my lifestyle, So
yeah. Good.
I'm in recovery, but it's really more of like just growing.
That's a great way to put it. I've started to see it over the years as I get to be in recovery, not that I've got to be in recovery, because recovery now means to me, really, it means more about growing up and maturing, which is a lifelong process. So I don't see it as a negative thing anymore. Good. All right. So you mentioned your first connection with sponsor. I mean, same thing for me when I got in recovery, 12-step work. They kept saying this thing about you need a sponsor. And I'd never heard of the term before, didn't know what they were talking about. And they began to explain to me, well, that's somebody that's a little ahead of you or way ahead of you in the 12 steps, has kind of walked the walk, not just talked the talk, and can be a guide or someone that can carry you through your own step work. And so the idea was very foreign to me that I should be willing to go and ask somebody for help. I didn't do that very well. The toughest thing in the world for me to say to somebody was, I need help. And then even tougher was to say to a specific person, would you help me? And so they were asking me to do.
Like in 12 steps, part of the spiritual experience of 12 steps to me is that you have to believe in a power greater than yourself. And that sponsor is a part of that power greater than yourself. So you find a sponsor and then you kind of trust God, trust the universe, whatever, to allow that sponsor to guide you and give you honest feedback and kind of keep you on the path that you said you wanted to go on when you came to that sponsor.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so what you're describing in a sense is a powerlessness coupled with the humility, the willingness to ask for help. And then the second most important thing is to actually do what the helper said to do, right?
Exactly.
So I had never submitted to anything like that at that depth in my life. Never even occurred to me.
Mhm.
But I remember I was very blessed in my early years of recovery, 15, 20 years ago, when I did finally ask someone. I had two really good sponsors over the first 5 years of recovery. Not everybody that I tried was able to do it or could do it or said yes, but I had two different men over a 5 or 6 year period that said yes. And they were both excellent sponsors, very consistent with me in meeting with me and guiding me, not solving my problems, but showing me how to think through differently and giving me a place to practice what it meant, both to be humble and grateful at the same time. But I got to admit, in the beginning, it was such a foreign thing that it seemed like something from outer space to submit to some type of a relationship like that.
I think it depends. A lot of times people come to recovery on a lot of different paths. And I think when I came, I knew that what I was doing wasn't working. It hadn't been working and it kept blowing up on me. And so even though I had heard about 12 steps, I didn't really know about it. So I at least, you talk about that humility, I think I at least came in with the attitude of like, let's see, and I think that was the same way I approached my sponsor. Say, for example, you were my first sponsor and you said, well, okay, for the next 30 days, you're going to call me every day. I was like, okay, I'll do that. And some days I would think of it late and I'd call you at 10 o'clock. I knew you'd be asleep, but I'd leave a message. But it was just the discipline and the consistency of doing something that somebody told me without me like, making an excuse or trying to, slip and slide my way out of it.
Yeah. Which it's kind of like the beginnings of humility, which is, I know what I was lacking when I came into recovery. So yeah, that's a great point. The idea of asking someone for help, then getting a specific suggestion for help, and then following through on it, even if it seemed meaningless or maybe if it seemed too hard to do, but just to trust that if I'll continue to do things like that, sooner or later things will get better. Yeah.
And I think that, it's really important to have, especially when you're first coming into recovery, to have a sponsor that can maybe challenge you. You don't want someone that like, okay, call whenever you want and I'll see you when you want and you go to meetings when you want and, I hope it works out.
Yeah, I was lucky in that what you described, in that the first person I asked that said yes was very strong on structure, not making me do things, but saying, here are the things that will help you get better. If you want me to sponsor you, I've got to see you consistently working on these things. Otherwise, he would say, I'm going to be working your recovery harder than you are, and that's not healthy for either one of us, right? So that kind of gets into the idea of as strong as those relationships are, like any other relationship in life, it's easy for that relationship to slide into kind of a codependent type of relationship or behavior from either side of the equation. Does that make sense?
It does, but I do think that it is more the responsibility of the sponsor to guard that and guide that than the sponsee, because the sponsee's just coming off the street. He could be codependent, he or she, you know what I mean? They may not know, but as a sponsor, I have to, what you said is really true, set some guidelines and some boundaries. Like when you first said, okay, I want you to go through a step study, I want you to come to these meetings, keep going to the counselor that sent you to me, I want you to call me, and I was like, oh, okay, because I knew that what I was doing wasn't working.
Yeah. And I got to say, it was really honestly, it was really easy to sponsor you. For whatever reason, you were ready, and you may not have done it perfectly, but you actually did consistently try to stay within the guidelines and do the work that I was suggesting. Now, I think one really important point we want to make to folks is if you are sponsoring right now, it's really important for you to be sponsored as well. I think it's always very healthy if you're going to sponsor anybody that you need to have a good sponsor you're relying on for a couple of reasons. One, so that you don't slide into the codependent behavior we were talking about, where you're working somebody's recovery more than they are, or where you may be taking on too many sponsees, or your life is not structured as such where it's healthy for you to sponsor. So I think having our own sponsor as sponsors is really important.
When I also, Art, I think that based on what's happening in life, you may like up your need for a sponsor. So when I was the ministry leader at Celebrate Recovery, it was suggested you need to get a sponsor. Or if you're going through, a death or a divorce or a tragedy or something in your life, you might need, you know what I mean? So sometimes you can kind of just go through and you may not need a sponsor, but especially if you are going through something in your life, you need someone else to walk next to you, because I think that's the thing about the sponsor is honesty is really key. So one of my favorite stories about you was when I was going to do my amends to my daughter, and she was going to school in California, and I said, Art, I'm gonna do my amends tour, and then we'll talk about it all the way to California. And you're like, Tim, I don't know if that's a good idea. It seemed like a great idea to me at the time.
Yeah.
But when you said it, it made me think about it. And I trusted you enough to say, well, okay, well, maybe not. I mean, now looking back, it was like, who knows what could have happened if I had done that.
Yeah. Well, and that's another example of what we were both saying a minute ago is a good sponsor guides, but a good sponsor doesn't make the decision for the sponsee. And then on the sponsee side, they've got a responsibility to listen well and then ask questions. And what you did in that situation was you paused and you asked me why I thought it might not be a good idea. And then we explored it, and eventually you were able to make your own decision, and you saw the wisdom of maybe that wasn't the right setting. The ninth step always reminds us that timing is really important when we're making amends. We want to do it in the right timing because we want to avoid harm to someone else, right? And I think when we discussed that, you began to see, as anxious as you were to do it in that timing was probably not the wisest thing to do. So it took both of us thinking through that and then you making the decision. And I think the fact that you remember that from so many years ago obviously had an impact, and I suspect has an impact on the way you've sponsored other people.
Well, because it's funny, because it's like, I thought it was such a great idea.
Yeah.
I remember going to you like it was such a, man, and you were kind of like, you didn't want to bust my bubble, but you were like, well, let's talk through this. And as we talked, I was kind of like, oh. And it just started making sense, because we come to recovery because we're coming out of denial. We've been lying to ourselves anyway. So we need that's why honesty is so key in the sponsor, because as a sponsee, I've been lying to myself all the time about this addiction or this habit or attitude or whatever.
Yeah.
And I need someone that's going to be kind and loving, but kind of like say, well, Tim, I don't think so.
Yeah, that's a good point, because the same thinking that got us into recovery is not the thinking that's going to get us out and grow us up. Not only get sober, but begin to mature in the way we think about all parts of life, where we get wisdom from, how do we make decisions, how do we handle emotions and disappointment and conflict and anger and all those types of things. The way I was doing it before, it wasn't just that I was addicted. There was a lot of things about the way I did life that needed to change and to grow, right? So just the idea of, like you said, that, an addict will tell a lie when the truth would have served us better, right? We don't even know how much we lie to ourselves when we get in recovery. We know a little bit about it, but we began to see how deceptive we really are. And the sponsor relationship is one of the key places for that to come out, I think. One other thing I want you to talk about too is the idea of, I think of it this way. I was taught early on in a way that sponsor relationship, and I tend to always think of a sponsor-sponsee typically as being same gender, but that's not necessarily the case. It's not always that way. But for me, I was introduced to it that way for safety reasons. And so I generally think of it that way. But one of the things I saw early on was that after a year or two of being sponsored well, was that I had learned how to practice intimacy with another human being in a very safe way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And certainly not talking about physical intimacy. I'm talking about the intimacy of sharing the deepest, the hardest, the darkest, the most shameful parts of who I was, but also sharing the good and the dreams and the hopes and doing it in a vulnerable way. Does that make sense?
Well, I think that like with a good sponsor, I think that honesty is going to be key. You know what I mean? So I remember when we did step 5. I remember step 5 took like 5 hours. Oh, no, excuse me, 2 hours, two and a half hours. But it was very freeing for me because, I mean, number one, I wrote down all this stuff that I never would want anybody to know. Number one. And then number 2, I read it to somebody. But yet there was no judgment, there was no shock and awe and disgust. It was just acceptance.
Yeah.
And I think that like when you get that once on that level, then you're actually able to give it yourself, but then you're continuing to want to get it, because I think that a part of the denial is I've built so many layers on, like who I think I should be or who I think other people think I should be. And then you put the drug use or the sexual addiction on it, and it's just a mess, a swirling mess.
Yeah.
So when you talk about that honesty and intimacy and getting down to who you really are, you don't really want to go back to that false, pretending, lying, drama-laden, lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, because by the time some of us get to recovery, the layers of shame and guilt are pretty deep, pretty heavy. And I know if I'd ever had any hope that I could tell the truth about myself, I think I had just about lost all hope that I could live a life. And maybe my best hope at that point was to die and nobody ever know. And so that's a pretty heavy burden to walk around with. I know a lot of people in recovery come in that way. It's just true. So finding a place where, and for those that don't know, what Tim's referring to in step 5 is the admission of the exact nature of our wrongs to God, to ourselves, and to someone we trust, to another human being, what he was describing there. And again, but pre-recovery, I could not have imagined that I would have been able to do that, even just a fraction of it. But somehow through grace, somehow through luck or design, I was led into the 12 steps, into groups, into step studies, and then into sponsorship. And that was the biggest place of freedom for me, to begin to lose those layers you were talking about and begin sobriety, but not only sobriety, but as we talked about earlier, a pathway of growth that could exist for the rest of my life.
I guess, when the 12 steps is described, especially in the meetings, it's called like a spiritual journey, or it's a spiritual practice. And really, I think the sponsor-sponsee relationship is strongly a part of that spiritual experience. I remember I had a sponsor, I didn't have him really that long, maybe a year and a half. But he told me, he said, you know, every morning I wake up, he said, before I get out of bed, I do step 1 through 3. And I thought about it. He kind of walked through and told me what he did. I was like, oh, I'm gonna try it. And I still try that sometimes I wake up in the morning and I do step 1 through 3. You know, so the thing is, a sponsor relationship may not be, I mean, it's like now we're really just friends and accountability brothers, but there is not like a rule book that says, okay, you're gonna have a sponsor for this time, then you're gonna be fixed. And
Yeah.
You know, so you have sponsors are like for seasons, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Folks are probably wondering about that in this sense that when you sign up and you agree to be a sponsor, if somebody asks you, what are you locking yourself into? Is it a long-term thing? Is it lifelong? No, not necessarily. Most sponsors are for a season, as you said. And those are the kind of things that's important to know about sponsoring and being sponsored. Those are the things that the sponsor and the sponsee negotiate with each other as to what the expectations are, right? I mean, you mentioned, okay, with each other, we were able to lay out some things. These are the things I ask you to do, or these are the things I agree to do. And so we've got this clear communication and expectation. So that's a big part of sponsoring. And again, it's one of those things most of us are kind of weak at when we come into recovery, and that's clear communication. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, a lot of us don't communicate that clearly with each other. And this is a new way to learn how to do that. So yeah, sponsoring is often temporary. It may be for a few months while somebody is working the steps, maybe a year, maybe longer. I've certainly sponsored people for lengthy periods of times. And yours and I, we're in our second decade now of helping each other. I want to share along those lines about how the kind of the tables turned for us about 8-9 years ago. We'd known each other for a number of years. I'd sponsored you. We'd become very good friends. And I hit a patch in life where I was really struggling. I wasn't returning to the addictive behaviors, but I was severely discouraged, emotionally very drained, and I could see a severe depression beginning to set in, something I'd never experienced before. And it was at that low point that I reached out to you because we had the connection and said, hey, I need help. And I need help in a really specific way. And it's pretty serious, right? And I'll never forget, you said, sure, when and where? When and where? And we ended up going to a basketball gym. You drove all the way across town. We met in the gym and we shot a basketball, that simple. I could barely get the ball to the rim, I think. And we shot and we sat and we talked and we cried and you listened. And it's still emotional for me all these years later because of the way you committed to being of help to me when I asked. And that's been one of the most important parts of my recovery.
Well, and see, for me, it was like full circle. It was a blessing. I mean, it was a blessing because you had helped me so much at really I would say the worst part of my life. Because I kept doing the same stuff over and over again. And even my solutions weren't working, not long term. So by the time I came to you and I went to the counselor and went to, Hattiesburg. So I was doing all this stuff to try to turn it around. But you were like the consistent, and I'm gonna just break in and say something else about sponsorship. Another thing is that we were meeting weekly. So you said, okay, you're gonna call me every day for 30 days. But then as your sponsorship continued, it was like once a week, sometimes even at least once a week, we would either have a phone call or we'd meet, and it was a check-in. You know what I mean? And that's an important part of the process. But when you said I need help, I was like, it kind of showed me that I was growing. You know what I mean? So it was a blessing. I mean, so I was like, sure, man. I mean, and I think that's why to me it's a spiritual relationship because it's really, when you get to step 12, it's all about service. And the more service I do for somebody, that helps my recovery. My recovery is strengthened as I do stuff for other people. You know what I mean? Where when I was out acting out and drugging out, it was all about me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that was a transition, and you showed me because you spent a whole lot of time with me. I mean, sometimes we would go to lunch and spend 2 hours at lunch, and I was like, dang, this is a lot of time. I mean, and it wasn't like I wasn't enjoying it, but to me, it was a lot of quality time that you were just giving me, but you were showing me how to do it.
Well, your point about the 12 step, having had a spiritual awakening, we try to give it away, right? And there's an old saying in 12 step, what comes to you, if it doesn't go back out, won't come back again. And you hear that in a lot of different settings. Whatever you've been given, you must give it freely so that it freely can return. And it begins to pay dividends, and it's kind of a feedback loop, a positive growth loop out there. And so I love the way you described that at that point, it kind of blessed you by saying, oh, okay, I've grown more than I even knew, and now I can give back. And so it was a pivotal time for me. Your commitment, as I said, as simple as saying, let's go shoot a basketball, because that's about all I could do for a while. I was so broken. And your ministry to me was just to sit and shoot and laugh and cry and talk and pray. And then eventually things could break open where we could really do some solid 12-step work. And you committed to, just like you were talking about our commitment earlier, you did that with me. Spent a lot of time, a lot of nurturing, a lot of guidance. And so I thank you for that. That was a huge blessing for my life. Probably wouldn't be here without it, honestly.
Well, and I mean, again, it's like an opportunity for me to give back. And to be honest, even though you're talking about how much it helped you, it probably helped me just as much. You know what I'm saying? Because I learned to listen. Because I didn't really know. I mean, I knew you were going through something, but you know what I'm saying? So I just had to listen and just kind of be there and you know, as I was led, maybe say something, I just respond, but it was a learning experience for me.
So let me ask you a question. During your time of sponsoring people, because I know you've sponsored many people over the years and are being sponsored, what has helped the most in terms of, say, structure? For instance, for me, I know that using the 12 steps as a guide and being intentional about movement through the steps has been a big deal for me all through my recovery. So what about you? Talk a little bit about how structure has helped.
Well, I mean, I think the 12 steps in general is definitely a tool, and specifically, I mean, like once we did a group and we met on Sundays, we used Spiritual Kindergarten, which is a 12-step book. I've used that with people to sponsor them sometimes. I mean, Pat Carnes has like a 12-step workbook, but one of my sponsors used with me. You know what I mean? But I think that having some kind of material that involves reading, writing, and then discussion and some kind of contemplation as you read, because that's the spiritual aspect of it to me. You know what I mean? It's not like you just, a sponsor waves a wand over a sponsor's head and they stop acting out. And, you know, it's like and the same work that I started when I first came to Celebrate Recovery, in a sense, I'm still doing it. I mean, I just have different material.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true with the sponsee. You want to try to give them the tools to grow so that even if you aren't their sponsor anymore, they still have that spiritual practice, that recovery practice going on.
Yeah, good. That's good. All right. So another question, if you had to list the top one or two characteristics of a good, a healthy, effective sponsor? What are a couple of things that come to mind?
I think a sponsor is a good listener. I think a sponsor, whatever your drug of choice is, your sponsor has enjoyed some kind of sobriety in it. So they have an experience of not doing that thing, so they can kind of help walk you through it. I think hopefully when I talk of spirituality, it's not like, okay, you all are necessarily going to church or the synagogue or whatever together, but that sponsor has a sense of a higher power and has a sense of humility and can pass that sense of humility and submission to that higher power as part of this process. A higher power could be going to a meeting. It can be maybe taking the sponsor's advice. It can be reading some books. It can be going to church. I mean, there's, and I think also a sponsor should be doing the work themselves. You know what I mean? So the sponsor goes to meetings. The sponsor maybe has a sponsor. They're doing some of the same things that they're telling you to do. They're already doing it. They're doing the work themselves.
Yep, makes total sense. Another one that comes to mind for me, which I guess probably goes without saying, but I think it's hard to find sometimes, is that they're trustworthy in terms of their anonymity and confidentiality. Mm-hmm. In other words, I'm very open. For whatever reason, the last 17 years, my life it's just been arranged where it's okay for me to talk publicly, and I don't hide my anonymity. I try to share appropriately, but it's kind of an open thing out there, right? But I would never assume that for anybody I sponsored. So as far as I'm concerned, they're always anonymous in the sense that nobody knows I'm sponsoring, at least for me, and confidential in that nothing that's shared goes to anybody else. And that may sound like that's an easy thing to find, but it's not always that easy.
Well, for me, that's like such an important point because I grew up in the church, but I kind of in the church always felt like I had to be a certain way. The dark side of me, it was no way I wanted to expose it because I kind of felt, and maybe I wouldn't have been accepted, But when you have someone that says, well, okay, you've got this dark stuff. Yeah, I got some dark stuff too. We all got some dark stuff. So, let's just be honest, and I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to condemn you. I'm going to accept you. I'm going to love you. Because we're all human beings. I mean, nobody on this planet is any better than the other, period. And that's what a sponsor kind of gives you, that like, hey, I'm with you. I'm like you. We can make it through this together.
Yeah, that's good. We talked about that a little while ago, this idea that coming into recovery, most of us feel kind of the big book would say we kind of think we're terminally unique. we're going to die from this and that nobody else is like this. Mm-hmm. And maybe one of the first things we find out that's common is no, there's other people that struggle in similar ways and feel similar about themselves in similar ways. And that's sometimes all that's needed to connect us at first. But then what we find we have in common, the more that we're in communion and relationship with each other, the more we go down and we begin to see, no, we got way more in common than that. In fact, what divides us is minuscule compared to what unites us. And that begins to strengthen the way we can help each other, not just with sobriety. Yes, that's important. Some of us need sobriety originally to keep our life, our liberty, our job, our marriage, our health, or whatever. So sobriety is huge. Don't get me wrong. It's often the beginning of the learning. But beyond sobriety, there's much more of life and much more of maturity and growth we need. And I have found the sponsor relationship and the friendships that come out of that to be a lifelong blessing.
Mhm. Well, because I think that once you begin to open up to another human being on that deep and honest and personal level, I mean, there's like a connection there that you just don't just open up like that to anybody. So obviously, any person that you open up to like that, there's going to be a connection.
Yeah. So one other thing that occurs to me as a characteristic while we were talking is that a good sponsor would be patience. Does that make sense? Talk about that a little bit. How does that occur? How have you seen that with sponsor, but also how have you implemented that when you sponsor folks?
I think that, and I guess when we first come in recovery, we differentiate ourselves as addicts versus the other people. But really, like you just said, all of us are kind of the same. It's just that the quote unquote addict drug of choice may not be socially acceptable, and their behavior may be less socially acceptable. But I believe that everybody on this planet's got some issue, you know? And I think that, like, when I realized that, okay, I come into recovery when I'm 52. It took me 52 years to build up all of this crap that I built up. Now, I wish I could just, Brother Art could wave a wand and by 53, I'm done. And, everybody's realizing how great I am again, But it doesn't work like that. You know what I mean? So if it took me 52 years to get here, it's going to take me some time to kind of unravel it.
Yeah.
And if I go through that time to unravel it, then I'm going to be a little more patient with you as you unravel it. But I'm going to keep trying to say, well, hey, man, it's not going to be solved in a day. I mean, here's a good example, Art. So, like, almost everybody come in recovery and they start seeing a little light and they realize, oh, this is good. And they get a little knowledge. And then they're like, well, shoot, I'm ready to go out and save the world. How come nobody's, I need to go, and it's like, man, you've been in like 2 months. Just wait another 2 months, 3 months.
Yeah. We could knock that out of you, right?
Yeah. So patience is important because it's growth and it's really organic. So if you think of how plants grow, the crops grow. I mean, it takes time, it takes sun, it takes water, and so it's the same way. And as a sponsor, I think giving our sponsees hope kind of like goes with the patience.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. That's a great point because at some point in the process, many times, maybe especially in the beginning of recovery, but certainly times along the way after that, hope sometimes seems to dwindle. Mm-hmm. Maybe even the threat that there is no hope. And so to have another living, breathing human being that we're connected to that can constantly remind us that there is hope and that they're an example of it is huge. That's a good one there. All right, so we got a question that came in that has to do with, they're saying, okay, this sounds good, the sponsor thing, but where would you go about finding somebody like we're describing, right? And I know for me that in the beginning, I thought the same thing. When they started saying you need one and then they described what that person should be like, I was like, where in the heck would you find somebody like that? So let's talk a little bit about how people might go about finding a sponsor. What are some of the ideas you've come across in the past?
Well, and I think that, what you've talked about a lot today is humility. And I think that finding a sponsor can be a very humbling experience because it's kind of like, I don't know if you ever, well, I know you did date. And, you see this girl, you're looking at her, and finally you get up enough courage to go and ask her out. And then what happens?
No.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're shattered. But that's possible with a sponsor.
that's right.
Every sponsor that you go to is not going to just say, okay, come on, I was waiting for you.
Yeah,
So there's going to have to be a certain amount of humility in going through that process as the sponsee and just being open to someone saying not now. Or sometimes you can find a temporary sponsor. You can
yeah,
find someone, hey, can you just sponsor me as I go through these 12 steps? Or I'm just, this first month, can you sponsor me and maybe help me find a permanent sponsor?
yeah,
But I think your question and the best place I would think is whatever your drug of choice is, go to that specific meeting. So if it's alcohol, go to AA meeting. If it's drugs, go to NA. If it's gambling, go to, if it's SAA, go to, if it's sex addiction. So I go to Celebrate Recovery,
yeah.
but I think that you definitely want to go to a recovery-based meeting that is based on the 12 steps.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my suggestion.
Yeah, and I think it's smart because, again, the 12 step says give back. So you're going to find somebody there that's ahead of you that's, like you said earlier, is wanting to give back what they've been given. And so one reason amongst many that people would say 90 meetings in 90 days is not just to punish you to go to 90 meetings in 90 days, because the more meetings you and I are willing to go to, the more we're exposed to a number of different people. And if we're listening, sooner or later, we'll hear somebody that we can ask. I know it seems
And I
daunting.
think what you're saying is that you can ask them. The reason why you're asking them is because their experience or the way they're explaining it or the way they're talking about their recovery or how they deal with life, it's something about it that appeals to you. It draws you.
Absolutely. And to get that experience, often we have to attend a lot of different meetings. Sometimes 90 and 90 days just helps me find a home group. That's pretty important. Sometimes 90 and 90 days is just an integral part of my daily sobriety. That's important. But going to a lot of different meetings, a lot of different times will expose me, like you said, and I'm hearing something from individuals about their humility, their sobriety, the way they handle life, the way they explain themselves. And there's something attractive about that that says, hey, maybe they could help me. And then, as you said, the step of humility. Somebody told me once the two greatest, toughest sentences in the world to say are, I need help, and would you help me? And but I believe it. For me, those are tough things to say.
And another thing, this is not exactly
So we're fixing to wrap up. Go ahead. Go ahead.
exactly sponsored, but I think that it is also good to have like other people in recovery that are like your accountability partners or your accountability friends that serve as another level. Your sponsor, you're kind of like submitting almost to them. Your accountability partners, you all are like peers almost.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. To have more than just one person to rely on, it takes a bit of a community to develop, because sometimes people are not going to be available for different reasons. And so we need to build a community to continue our growth and our sobriety. A sponsor is one of the key. In fact, I saw a statistic many years ago, right after I had started being sponsored, and then went to a group meeting and they were teaching, and there was a statistic that said for someone in recovery, the percentages of staying sober, getting sober and staying sober, if you did meetings was at this level. If you did meetings plus counseling, it rose to this level. But if you did those things and then got a sponsor and then consistently worked with the sponsor, it astronomically shot up as far as the percentages of how people got better and how long they stayed sober and grew up. The sponsor relationship seems to kind of be a catalyzer to people's, not just their sobriety, but their growing up. So we're going to close here. Last question we had was, what are other sources that we have found as far as giving connection to sponsors? So you mentioned how you got to that. I think you said it was because you were using a counselor, and the counselor said to you, you need to go to a meeting and you need to get a sponsor. What are some other ways maybe you've heard? Is there any other way you've heard people connect to sponsor in the past?
I mean, it's not unusual at a meeting for someone to just say at the end of the meeting, you know, I'm new, I'm looking for a sponsor. If anybody is willing to sponsor me, I'd like to talk to you after the meeting. You know, or sometimes people say, hey, I'm willing to be a sponsor if someone needs one, you know, so either one of those situations can, you know, help facilitate the process.
Yeah, there's some traditions in which you go to a meeting, they're going to have a list or they're going to ask if you need one, and that's great. I know a lot more because of social media today, say in the Birmingham area, even Facebook Recovery Birmingham. There's a lot of resources out there that are confidential where if you say I'm looking, somebody's going to connect you to somebody down the line and help you get to a place where you can actually ask that question of somebody. So as much as we often decry some of the things in social media, right now especially, that's a big deal. And so there's a lot of resources out there for that. I remember sponsoring somebody many years ago, and their pastoral counselor said, you got to go to a meeting and you got to get a sponsor or don't come back and see me. And that's you know, that's pretty tough for somebody to say that to. And the person said, I guess he's serious. And they actually followed through on it as well. Some other ways people get connected to the sponsor, other than just attending 12-step, is if you'll check with some of the addiction therapists in your community. Often they know how to connect you. Pastoral counselors often know how to connect. Again, the main thing is finding as many meetings as you can go to, making yourself vulnerable enough after you've listened to ask the question. And it's okay to hear no, as you said earlier. That's going to take place sometimes. It's okay. Just keep listening and keep praying and keep asking. And I've never seen anybody that wasn't able to connect to someone when they were really serious about looking for it. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to wrap up our time. Thank you for being with us today. Tim, before we go, anything you'd like to add, just one final statement or a comment or anything?
Well, I confess, the first basketball game we played, you did skunk me.
Okay.
But I didn't know you were going to be that serious about it.
Okay. I remember you did say, man, you're serious about this. I still had a lot of anger issues, so I used that energy, you know, to do that. Well, again, brother, thank you for being on this, but more than that, thanks for being who you are to me and to so many other people. And I love you. And
Love you too, man. Thank you.
yeah, thank you. And guys, thanks for joining us today. If you want to get on the Addiction Prevention Coalition email list, website, just if you'll contact them through Facebook or at apcbirmingham.org. You can get on the mailing list. You can volunteer. You can help with resources, and just stay healthy and stay in recovery, guys. Thanks. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.